This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Ray Alex Williams is a detrans philosopher who wrote a book on trans feminism and philosophy when he was still identifying as trans. After detransition, however, he started a YouTube channel to share his experiences and educate people on gender issues suppressed in the mainstream discourse. Here's our conversation with Ray Alex Williams. All right, welcome back to Transparency. It's been a minute, but we're very, very happy to be back. I'm Aaron Terrell, joined as ever by Aaron Kimberly, and we're very excited to talk to Ray Williams today. Thanks so much for being here, Ray.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here.
I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a few weeks now, and only a few weeks because I wasn't aware of you until the last few weeks. So you kind of popped onto the scene, and yeah, you got a great YouTube channel where you explain a lot of stuff related to just kind of like trans culture wars and autogynephilia specifically, because that's been your experience. And so you, yeah, anyway, so great YouTube channel. You're saying a lot of great stuff on Twitter as well. And yeah, just really excited to talk to you about all that.
Yeah. Where do you want to start? I feel like there's so many angles to approach.
Yeah,
it's a big topic.
I usually like to start like kind of well, no, Aaron, you usually say and ask some very important, or it's kind of really, really thoughtful therapy type question in the beginning, and then I usually just want to do like a chronological thing. But what really got my attention was when I was reading your the bio that you sent over to us. I didn't realize that you had written a book on trans feminism. Can we start there, or what? Like,
yeah, sure.
Much different place mentally, because a lot of this podcast is obviously people's different arcs in understanding their experience and whatnot. But yeah, I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, so my academic background is in philosophy. So I have a master's in philosophy, and I went to a PhD program in philosophy as well. And I started my transition when I was 28 years old, and I was in grad school at the time. I was in my 5th year of my PhD program. And so I started a blog. The blog was called Trans Philosopher, and it was, partly autobiographical, talking about my experiences with early transition. And it was also philosophical. I was, reading people like Julia Serrano and engaged in trans studies. And I actually started writing a dissertation on sort of the ethics of gatekeeping and, transgender healthcare. And so I was very interested in, trans studies, queer theory, gender theory, and all these sort of like, like what would be considered like the discourse on trans stuff. And I was heavily involved in like blogging and on Twitter back in the day. And so you wrote all these essays on my blog, and a publisher reached out to me saying, hey, would you be interested in writing a book? And so I put together an essay collection on transgender feminism and philosophy. And a lot of that perspective was influenced by the fact that, one, I was identifying as trans at the time. And, I was also early in transition. So obviously, many years later, and also having detransitioned now, my opinions have, very much changed. So yeah, it was an interesting experience because I guess I would be considered to have contributed to, trans activism in some way or another, largely from a more philosophical perspective, but nevertheless, that's kind of where I started in all this conversation. So I've been involved in the discourse in one way or another for many years. It's just sort of lately, I kind of just, have a career and a job, and, so I kind of got re-engaged with the discourse after I detransitioned, because all this stuff is kind of, I'm just thinking about things from a totally different perspective now.
What was that like, that kind of shift? Because a lot of us, and obviously most people who come on the show have had that experience of being a full-blown, believer to being, the sort of going in the other direction. What was that like for you?
I mean, it's been really interesting because, there's a sort of idea that, that people will say who are involved in trans activism that like, transphobia is like a gateway to all these, conservative right-wing ideas and stuff. But for me, it's more like that way of thinking, being wrapped up in mainstream trans discourse and stuff like this, like it was really correlated with many other political beliefs and perspectives. So when I sort of became skeptical of these narratives, it sort of allowed me to be more free thinking in many other dimensions. So the trans issue sort of was a sort of perfect culmination of many ideological beliefs, largely, depending on how you trace the intellectual history, going back to postmodernism and sort of, skepticism about objectivity and stuff. So you can really trace that intellectual history pretty deep, and it, has a pretty large impact on your worldview when you sort of are unable to, ground yourself in the objectivity of biology. That sort of has subsequent effects on how you perceive the world and the assumptions you have about, how do you arrive at the truth and stuff. So sort of like breaking free from all that has really, been very intellectually interesting, because now that I feel freedom to explore, alternatives to gender theory, I have subsequently begun exploring many other ideas that were counter to my typical, liberal leftist, belief system. So it's been very interesting, and I'm still sort of evolving and developing lots of ideas. So I'm kind of fresh in the middle of, reconfiguring my worldview in many respects.
Is another book coming?
I don't know. I sort of am on the YouTube train now, and I sort of, the whole experience with traditional book publishing media. I like books, but you have to go through the editorial process, and it takes like years to publish, and no one reads books anymore anyway, and you get a limited percentage of royalties. So I kind of just like YouTube and Twitter these days.
More direct to consumer kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. But I don't know. I might. I was actually talking to my wife the other day, and she's like, "Oh yeah, you should write another book on this." So we'll see.
Your wife is a detransitioner as well, right?
Yes, depending on the terminology. I know people, sort of define these terms differently, but she should be considered a desister. So she never medically transitioned, but back in college, so this was like late 2000s, she identified as trans and socially transitioned, and so she's been in the desister, detrans community for like over a decade. So she has like a lot of experience, and kind of, that's kind of what was one of the impetus for my own detransition is she just sort of like started watching a whole bunch of detrans content, I guess what would be considered, gender critical content, or just, exposing to alternative, narratives to the mainstream trans discourse. And so I sort of, out of curiosity, started watching some of that content, and it just sort of like opened my mind to different possibility models. And so her experience with the detrans community and, her engagement with these issues, I just sort of, absorbed that through osmosis, I guess. And it just sort of like percolated in my mind, and it kind of led to an epiphany one day. And that was like, the detransition. There's a lot more to say there, so I don't know.
Maybe before we dig into that, I'd love to just hear your story and, the path that you took to a trans identity, and then we can talk about how you then found your way out of that ideology.
Yeah, I mean, depending on one's belief in the concept of autogynephilia, I'd say that was like the pathway towards my gender dysphoria. So, from a young age, I've been interested in cross-dressing. This definitely had like a fetishistic aspect that evolved in my teenage years. And so and for the longest time, throughout my 20s and whatnot, I just identified as a crossdresser. I thought I just had this like unique kink or weird interest in this. It was very much a sexual thing. But in my late 20s, when I was like 27 or 28, I was seeing a therapist for not related to gender issues, but I started talking about gender issues and cross-dressing and whatnot. And at the time, I just recently gotten divorced, and the divorce wasn't because I had like started transition or anything like this. It was like an unrelated. That's a whole other issue. But after I got divorced, I started sort of exploring more gender issues, and at the therapist at the time, like this is in 2015, and there's the trans tipping point. Caitlyn Jenner was in the news, and my therapist recommended I watch this interview with Caitlyn Jenner. This was prior to her big reveal, so it was, and she talked about her history of cross-dressing, like this lifelong history of secretive cross-dressing. And I was like, oh wow, like I actually relate to that narrative because I've had a lifelong history of secretive cross-dressing, but I never assumed like that would make me trans. So I was like, oh wow, you can be a trans woman, take on this identity of a trans woman and be celebrated by society. And, this certainly seems, more socially acceptable of a narrative than just being like a male identified crossdresser. And so that sort of started me down a process of researching things on the internet, and like, many trans people, trans women in particular, I started researching on Reddit, and Reddit is kind of an echo chamber, and you sort of, read all these stories. And one of the things I was interested in is like, well, I have this like fetishistic arousal aspect to my cross-dressing. Does that invalidate me as a trans woman? But when you go on Reddit and you search for that information, they'll say like, oh no, it actually proves you're a trans woman.
That's how it starts for all of us. It's often what they say. Yeah.
So it's like, oh well, this actually is like a common pathway to this. It seems pretty common. So I sort of like got validation that I wasn't unusual in having that life history. And so I, quickly adopted a trans identity because it's just, it allowed me to do the thing I wanted to do, which was cross-dress all the time. Then, that the rest is history, as they say.
You mentioned the social acceptability piece. Do you feel like that was one of the primary motivators? Were you looking for a way of like, how were you feeling about the cross-dressing? Did you feel any shame about it, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just sort of like, if you are a masculinized person, as I was, I've had like 11 rounds of laser hair removal on my beard. So even prior to this, I had a very thick beard shadow. So when I cross-dressed, it was like, very masculine appearing, and sort of that combination of like a masculine appearing male person combining with feminine clothing, it sort of like generates this like weird response of disgust in a lot of people. And I was, perceptive of that in myself. And so upon cross-dressing and wanting to, not just have this in the privacy of my home, but, socially transition, because that was like the first thing I came up with. I was like in grad school, I was like, well, I'm going to start a career. I want to be a professor, but like, it didn't seem like it would be very advantageous to my career to wear women's clothing, and be this like very male looking person in the classroom in front of students or whatever, or in my peers going to conferences, So I sort of initially landed upon a more like by gender sort of like, I was like, oh, like I'm both male and female. In my social life with friends and socialization, I'll, present feminine. And then in my work life, I'll present, masculine. And so, but that didn't last very long because I just realized that it, that would be hard to maintain. And then as soon as I started engaging in this, like moving towards the what would be considered in the community full time, that desire for full time, it just sort of it started generating gender dysphoria, such that I started like hating the masculine aspects of myself, which was the impetus for wanting to go on hormones and getting, you know, laser hair removal, and, you know, started really obsessing about passing and all this stuff. So it was the desire to transition that started triggering the generation of gender dysphoria that, you know, motivated me to put a lot more effort into passing and constructing like a coherent, like feminine identity.
We've heard that from a lot of people, and you know, people, and I myself have even described it almost like an addiction. Like once the idea of transition enters into our heads, it creates this almost tunnel vision and this really intense pull forward towards that goal. And it sounds like that's what you experienced. Like it sounds like you weren't really considering medicalization and then this therapist planted that idea in your head that was a possibility, and then that sounds like that took on a life of its own.
Yeah, yeah. The idea was very much planted in my head, but I want to be careful here because I see, and I grant that this is a personal choice in how people tell their narratives, but I personally, you know, like to acknowledge these external factors in taking on this identity. But at the end of the day, it was a decision, and I take accountability for it because I was an adult. I was 28 years old. Like, this is something I decided to do out of my own volition. It made sense to me at the time. But, you know, like if I kind of run the counterfactual, whether I would have taken on this identity if I, you know, lived in a different decade and had the same desires and experiences, probably not. But I don't want to paint myself as, you know, I don't like to paint myself as like a victim of, you know, the ideology. I take accountability and responsibility for those decisions. But, you know, it's absolutely the case that there was, you know, I was wrapped up in the zeitgeist, and yeah, it did become obsessive because I remember for those first 2 years or so, like early transition, I was just like obsessed with all things gender. I read like everything on Reddit related to trans. I was just like spending all my time on Reddit, and you just get like absorbed in this. You know, I was going to like local support groups, you know, spending time with like trans women, and you just sort of like, yeah, you just become like absorbed in the trans bubble, I guess. And eventually that all kind of like mellowed out, and I sort of like, you know, when I started my career, you know, and I just sort of started to live my life as a, you know, more or less regular citizen. But those first few years, yeah, it was definitely like obsessive.
So I'd like
it also
to hear...
does kind of track too that it happened in the wake of a divorce, because you kind of like probably a bit of an identity crisis situation there, and then you got the cultural water telling you how to make sense of your, you know, your sexual experience, you know, in this way, and then you got the whole ideology of the community, and it appeals to for all of us a lot of things.
My wife was aware that I cross-dressed, but I just sort of knew she wasn't like supportive of it. And I remember, you know, we watched, I think it was like Orange is the New Black, and like Laverne Cox's character, there was like a flashback where, you know, her character, you know, has this like similar history of like cross-dressing or something like this. And after that episode, you know, she like looked at me and she's like, are you ever going to want to transition? And like the way she said it, I knew that she didn't want me to go down that pathway. And so out of sort of like obligation to her as a husband, you know, I would just like resign myself to repressing these desires, even though watching that episode definitely sort of like started getting my imagination going. But at the time, I just like, you know, it was just like something that I did in privacy, and I knew she wasn't like a huge enthusiastic supporter of that. I could tell that she found, you know, it kind of disgusting in some way or another. But, you know, when we got divorced and I was a grad student, I had no responsibilities, no family, you know, I was in a liberal university setting in grad school, supportive of transition. And it was just like I had no responsibilities that would prevent me from taking on this transition. So I just kind of went for it. And, yeah, so it was kind of like the perfect timing, I guess, in my life. But, you know, I sort of hear all these like trans widow stories, and like, if we had stayed together, you know, for 20, 30 years, like, who knows how long I would have been able to like repress these feelings until like the dam burst. And that's why I'm, you know, like passionate about talking about these issues, particularly autogynephilia, because I think the lack of awareness sort of drives people to be in denial of their desires, which could make them less informed when they get into these serious relationships that have repercussions for people's lives. So I think, you know, people should be honest with themselves and their, you know, partners about these desires, unless they're capable of like committing to like certain, you know, way of being in a relationship, because not every like partner is going to be, you know, supportive.
What was early transition like for you?
I mean, a lot of anxiety, self-consciousness, neuroticism, obsession about passing, you know. But, you know, I dropped out of grad school in my 6th year in my PhD program, and so I worked at, you know, some, you know, service level jobs like you know, Starbucks, and I was a personal trainer. I delivered pizza. So I don't know, but I don't know. I live in a liberal, democratic, urban core. So I never really experienced that much like harassment or anything. And, you know, when I first came out in grad school, people were supportive. I mean, I was sort of like, but yeah, I don't know. I just sort of like a lot of my problems were in my own head. Like my obsession with passing, my, you know, victimization of like, oh, why are my parents like dead naming and misgendering me? Like, it's like, woe is me, you know. Sort of like, you know, I sort of like viewed the lens through like everyone's a bigot, and, you know, people are being hateful. And I sort of like, I just became very like neurotic in a sense, because I was like obsessed with passing, and that whole sort of, it just made me like hyper self-conscious. And like in my book, I actually have this chapter called like hypervigilance in the gender machine, where sort of it described this early trans phenomenology of just being like, you're out in public and you're just like hyper aware of everyone looking at you because you don't pass. And sort of like it creates this like level of like heightened self-consciousness. And it's just hard to like exist in a more or less be in the moment without this sort of like, you know, how are people perceiving me? You know, how are people reacting to me? Can they tell? Or are they judging me? And it just sort of like was all up in my head. Eventually that sort of like mellowed out as I got further in my transition. But those early years, I was definitely like, and also just, you know, kind of figure out like, you know, how to like, yeah, like, you know, like reconfiguring my entire wardrobe to dress like a sensible person and not like, you know,
Like a prostitute.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like I had a pretty good experience. I mean, it didn't prevent me from, you know, like having successful, you know, dating and relationships. I dated a lot of people and had, you know, good and bad and the dating world. And eventually I landed a job as, you know, a trans woman, like a very good career. And that I'm still in today. And
so you detransitioned on the job too.
Yes, as funny, like I transitioned in grad school, and then I started like my actual corporate career as a trans woman. So I never transitioned on the job per se, but I have detransitioned. So yeah, like a lot of people have they you know talk about like, oh, the difficulties of transitioning on the job, but I never really experienced that because I was hired as Rachel. But detransition, that's been interesting and very positive. I'd say I have a much better relationship with my coworkers now, like as like detrans, because like I said, like I'm not as self-conscious anymore. I'm not like worried about, oh, like, are they going to misgender me? I can just sort of like be myself more.
Nice. How long in total did you live as a trans woman?
8 years, and I was on
Okay.
hormones for 8 years, so a good chunk of my life. I'm 36 now, so it was a yeah, it was like a big chapter of my life, and so yeah, it's been interesting.
People like to, a lot of people, I know because, you and I both have been in a lot of these arguments with the people who kind of want to really have a dichotomous understanding of the young people swept up in the gender movement, and then the older AGPs, which you would technically have fallen into. You were 28, which is younger than the previous. What people expect from the 80s, the literature, right? It was much older, that whole middle age dam breaking, as you described. But you're kind of a perfect example of right in the middle of that. It's like, yes, you had this paraphilia from a young age. You can compartmentalize it and relegate it, to privacy in the bedroom until you encountered the online sphere and the social, just the social, current milieu who told that, again, I know it's your decision and everything, but it's the culture that you lived in that told you that was an option, right? And that wasn't an option before. But and Debbie Hayden has explained this as well, even though she obviously does fit the older, the older framework or template, whatever. But that same kind of ROGD response of like, once you find out you can do this, and I had this experience as well. I think that's what you were alluding to as well, Aaron. Not sure what's going on with my voice, but that kind of ROGD, obsessive compulsion. It's like, now that I know I can do this, like nothing is standing in my way.
Right. I think the question of RGD is like interesting, and I would want to be careful about disambiguating like the female experience versus the male experience, because my understanding of the phenomenon, at least how it's been articulated in the literature with the young females, is the gender dysphoria is on this hypothesis, it's like entirely generated out of the social contagion, whereas with the AGP form of it, there's a underlying like disposition that gets triggered, so to speak. So it's like an underlying latency, and if you don't have that underlying latency, you can stumble upon trans Twitter or Reddit or TikTok or whatever, and like if you don't have that latency and you stumble on this online world, you're not gonna get the social contagion as a male. That's what I would propose as a hypothesis. Whereas I think in the teenage female case, like the gender dysphoria may be more like explainable, like independent of a particular underlying latency that has a very clear trajectory, because with the AGP, I think it's very delineated. It's more rigid, I would say, and without that, I don't think like it's not gonna like rapidly onset, I guess, and to some extent, like the gender dysphoria like did sort of emerge out of nowhere quickly, but it has like an underlying basis that goes back much further. So that's kind of how I would disambiguate that. I don't know if that makes sense.
What were some of your?
That's exactly my take as well, with the males versus the females.
Yeah. What were some of your earlier experiences of AGP? And I asked that just for some framing, because the way that the current literature, like for example, the DSM-5, the way that they outline this is that there are multiple pathways to gender dysphoria. So there's the early onset type, which is associated with homosexuality, and the late onset type, which is associated with AGP. But it's my understanding, and I think you're saying this as well, that AGP itself isn't late onset, that you had early childhood memories of it. It's the gender dysphoria aspect that's later onset. Would you say that was true with your experience?
Yeah, I would say that's true. Like the AGP, my earliest memories of it manifesting were, this was pre-puberty. I had this particular fascination with hosiery. Like it's just is, and that was like the fetishistic aspect, is a particular latching on to this particular item of clothing as a young boy. And I remember even like just like being fascinated by this piece of clothing from a young age, and like, you know, yeah, and I just sort of like, you know, did anything I could to get my hands on this piece of clothing, and from my mother's, she would like discard them in like the trash can, and I would like get them out and like hide them away in like my bedroom under my mattress, like as a young boy, because I was just like, I had this fixation on this piece of like clothing, and this was pre-puberty, and but then the puberty sort of like, it just, it turned the, like, people don't realize this, but I was actually masturbating pre-puberty. It's just
A lot of
that
people do say that. Yeah.
but the puberty turned the it like just changed it turned the masturbation into an orgasmic thing. But I was actually pleasuring myself as pre-puberty. I remember that transition was confusing. I was like, what, like, why is this feeling different now? But this sort of like eventually grew more and more complicated. And, and when I was like in my teenage years, when I got a car, for example, I was like, oh, wow, now I can go to the store and like I can buy my own. Yeah, I remember I like got a car at like 16. I like went to like the department store, like Sears or something, and like bought my own like hosiery, because this was like my like obsession. There's like this fixation on this particular type of clothing. But then over the years, it sort of got like layered on. It's like, well, then it was like not just that particular piece of clothing, but it sort of evolved to incorporating other aspects of feminine attire, to the point where eventually I was like cross-dressing in full women's outfits. But yeah, I don't know. That was sort of, and also when I was young, I had these daydreams and fantasies. I remember having daydreams of being forcibly feminized in my dreams. Like these, like it is, and so some other weird sort of early memories and fantasies about this sort of stuff. So, and I've heard people say like, oh well, AGP, it's, they say, well, it's defined as a paraphilia, and paraphilias are sexual, and sexuality only arises in puberty. But if you read Anne Lawrence's book, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, like she has a whole sections devoted to evidence, scientific evidence showing that there are signs and inclinations of our orientations towards whatever, type of person we're attracted, either androphilic or gynophilic, and that manifests in like, like more, it's almost like it's like a crush. It's like the difference between a crush versus having like horny teenage lust. Like you can have that sort of like crush, and so you sort of know as a young age that you're attracted to femininity and girls, but it doesn't manifest sexually. And I think that's like an analogous for AGP, where it didn't take on its full paraphilic dimensions, but the underlying seeds are there. And I don't think I'm alone, because I've read many narratives, and these sorts of desires and inclinations and dispositions, like, now there's a debate about whether, all things being considered equal, if you hadn't been exposed to things like pornography or the online world, whether it would develop in the same way, and maybe it wouldn't. But I don't think that changes the fact that AGP as a phenomenon has its origins in young age, because I think a lot of the research I've seen on male sexuality shows that it often does start from a young age. It's not like the brain turns 12 and like magically a switch gets turned on. Like all things in the brain have some combination of nature and nurture. Like there's very few things with male sexuality that are entirely nurture or entirely nature. Everything in the brain is like a combination of nature and nurture, I would say.
When Mike Bailey was on Gender a Wider Lens, he talked about a case study of an adult man with AGP, and the son was also demonstrating like cross-dressing behaviors. And I know a lot of the in a lot of the comments, there were accusations that maybe that child was being sexually abused, and that was missed, and that child safeguarding wasn't happening. So I do want to ask and put that out there, because that's going to inevitably be the pushback on this conversation, right? I mean, did you have an okay childhood?
I had a very happy childhood. I absolutely have no memories of childhood abuse or sexual trauma or anything like this. Like, I had a very happy-go-lucky, normal childhood. I was like a rough and tumble boy, played in the neighborhood with all the other boys. It's very normal. Like, I had an older brother, which is interesting because, a lot of people, like Ray Blanchard has done studies on like the sort of older brother hypothesis of homosexuality. But I think if you sort of characterize like AGP and homosexuality and HSTS and all these different, manifestations of variations from the norm in regards to male sexuality, like if you buy into the older brother hypothesis, like, that matches my experience. So I don't know, maybe it's like there's a gradations, and like, it could be like a related in some way or another as far as like a deviation from the norm in terms of like normal, like heterosexual male sexuality being developed. But yeah,
I think those are two different mechanisms, though. the older brother hypothesis with the that has to do with like Aaron, I think you'll do it better justice, but it's essentially due to the older brothers, the having multiple older brothers results in potentially the younger brother being less masculinized. Something to do with the mom's response to testosterone, and so, but it seems to be kind of that's not happening at all with autogynephilia. I don't think that there's anything associated with that. Rather, what I have seen, and I'm not sure if you've seen this as well, but there does seem to be a lot of father-son and brother-brother pairs who experience autogynephilia.
Yeah, it's hard for me to. Yeah, I'm just kind of making up that hypothesis. I have no idea if it has any basis. I just thought it was interesting because like I heard that and I was like, oh yeah, I have an older brother. So, but yeah, it could be completely unsubstantiated. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think my dad. I never saw any signs. But I don't know these things with like AGP. I think it's hard to study empirically because you can be so deep into repression. And if you go online, you read stories, like there are what's in the community called reppers or repressors, like repression as a psychological phenomenon is like it can be very powerful to the point you can go your entire life without manifesting these in a way that's detectable by other people. So in terms of like the gradation or the spectrum of people for whom like the repression is not able to keep it repressed and it sort of spills out into their life to the point where they act upon it, versus people who are just able to successfully repress it their whole lives. And like, and maybe like there was a lot more cases of that in the past, because one of the functions of repression is like the superego, like the social acceptability of all this. So like, 60 years ago, like you have to be pretty like intensely feeling this stuff and have like some lack of inhibition in regards to like social norms to be able to like just openly do this stuff. Whereas nowadays there's like a model for doing it, and lots of encouragement online, and you can do it, and you can start expressing this stuff in like a Discord forum, or like you can play video games and like have a female name and like a voice changer, and you can sort of like explore all this stuff like without any real social repercussions now.
Almost the opposite, in that it's actively encouraged, especially, and this is the angle Joe Burgo takes in understanding AGP is that being a straight man is quite villainized in our current culture. I mean, it's a kind of a blip in time that this is happening, but that's true. I don't think that creates AGP at all, but I think what happens is if you are experiencing AGP in a culture that villainizes straight men and celebrates trans lesbians, I mean, that's gonna weigh a lot into your decision making process and
Yeah,
what you do.
totally. I mean, I think it's one thing to have AGP as an underlying propensity, but the thing is, it's just a propensity. It just disposes you to certain thought patterns, but ultimately you have a choice about how to express those. And when you are in a culture, let's say you're, a young male who has these underlying propensities, and you're in, a liberal context, such that if you, are a cis straight white male, that's like the, the uncertain belief systems. That's like the most evil person on the planet, who is responsible for all the evils that have ever begotten our society and our civilization. So if you want to have social cachet in your friend circle, if you want to like not just be like have all your experiences ignored because you have these certain intrinsic characteristics, because it's like, oh, like if you are a straight white male, cis straight white male, then you're supposed to be like, you're supposed to listen to everyone else, and you can't ever give your own thoughts or anything. So I could definitely see like why people would want to, like if you have this propensity and it both satisfies the desire to manifest that propensity, and it gives you like a different social cachet, such that now you are oppressed, and now you can speak and you can have your experiences listened to with compassion and empathy by your friend circle. Like, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know, I think like that would be a strong motivator, even if the motivations are unconscious, because I don't think people are like aware that this is like a factor. You can only sort of see it from the outside, I think, but when you're in this world, like you're not aware of what you're doing. It's like an unconscious process.
Aaron and I think, have experienced a bit of that in reverse, that now we're perceived as straight white men, and therefore we're not allowed to talk about trans issues or concerns about our healthcare system, because we're supposed to just shut up and listen to trans women, and especially, trans women of color, right? So it's such a backwards way of thinking, that why wouldn't we have an opinion on this stuff in our healthcare system, and especially our insights into what might be happening with the girls. Having,
Yeah,
we're natal females, so we have some insight into that, but we're told that we're not supposed to talk about this stuff.
right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard much from people like Richard Reeves and like the crisis of masculinity and all this sort of stuff, and regards to just like the ways in which boys and men, they're sort of like, there's this crisis of masculinity, such that it's like we don't know how to be like, um, there's not like a standard model these days. So if you're have these propensities, and you're sensitive, and you sort of like are sensitive or introverted or something like this, you're gonna like, it's very easy to retroject your historical difficulties living up to the male gender role, and then say like, well, this inability to fully embrace all these gender roles, that is like proof or evidence that one has this like gender identity or something like this, like and that was something I experienced very commonly, like in my opinion, like spending time with like trans women, who, most of whom, the ones I hung out with in my support groups, were like the AGP type, I would say. And this sort of like retrojection of like the transitioning at 40 years old, but I felt like this since like I was 5. I just like repressed it, and it's like who's going to say that's false? I mean, like, it's like, you can't like go back and measure like how someone thought at 5 years old. And we just tell ourselves these stories and we have these narratives. And I think it's very easy to sort of like, retroject.
I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure we give some time to your detransition story. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit here, and if you can just kind of talk about events leading up to your decision to detransition and the context around that.
So one of the main motivators was actually health related. So I had a pulmonary embolism when I was on hormones, and pancreatitis. And one of the causal factors that led to these health events was the fact that at the time I was taking oral estrogen. So when you take the oral form of estrogen, it has an impact on your liver more so than if you take patches or injectables. And so, and I had a history of smoking, which, they say like when I got like the script or whatever, like it's part of the informed consent process. So it's like, yeah, smoking is bad, but it's like, it's not like they will deny you that, or, they just say don't do it. But it's like, if you have an addiction to cigarettes, then, you're going to be putting yourself at pretty significant cardiovascular risk. And so I was just one of these unlucky people who had a very severe reaction to the oral form of estrogen. And so, subsequently that all got stabilized and I was on patches, and patches are supposedly, not as risky as far as this goes. And I was like, but yeah, as a result of this, and also just part of being in the trans healthcare system, like, you got to go to the doctor every 3 months, get your blood checked. You got to, do the patches like twice a week. And it's very annoying to do the patches. And I was taking like the testosterone blocker spironolactone, which is a whole host of side effects. And I like, for whatever reason, I never really wanted to get an orchiectomy. Like I just put it off. I just kept putting it off and putting it off. I didn't really know why. I just like, I don't want to do that. Like partly it's like financial, but I don't think that was the real reason. I think like unconsciously, like I knew that, it was just like I had this like unconscious resistance to doing that. I don't know why. I'm kind of very grateful that I never did, obviously now, but at some point, once I started watching these detransition narratives, and there was like one detrans creator in particular, I think it was on TikTok, where, it was like a detrans woman, and she started talking about how like detransition can be something you do out of joy, more or less. Like it was sort of like you can detransition and be happy, and that never really occurred to me. And so, and then coupling that with like the healthcare concerns, I don't know, like philosophically, I was like, well, I don't want to be attached to the medical system. I don't want to be going to the doctor every 3 months for the rest of my life, and nor do I want to do these patch things for the rest of my life, nor do I want to take spironolactone for the rest of my life, and I didn't want to get surgery. So I was just like, well, what do I do? And I just like randomly one day I had an epiphany. I was just like, I don't want to do this, and I just like stopped the hormones. And at that exact moment when I made that decision, I was not necessarily sure if I would like correspondingly socially detransition. I was just like, oh, well, I'm gonna live as a trans person, but do my best just with testosterone, because I wanted to be natural. I suddenly realized I just wanted to be like a natural person independently of the pharmaceutical industry, because it just seemed like healthier to me. Like, and so as a result of that decision, that sort of like started a cascade of like subsequent decisions where eventually I was like, well, I'm going to socially detransition as well, which was also sort of made from like an epiphany of sorts. And yeah, so I don't know.
It actually kind of sounds like the way you transitioned as well. It's just kind of like, well, okay, I guess I'll do this, or I'll do this that way, and then sort of like a very
totally. It was
titrating.
It was a kind of like very parallel. It was like an epiphany in both directions. I just sort of like decided like, hey, this is, it was like a leap of faith because, I just wasn't sure, like, I don't know, it just seemed very daunting to me to detransition. It's like, oh, I have to like change my name and like come out at work, but it actually ended up being really great. Like work was very accepting. It was like there's like a total like non-issue. And obviously like as soon as I like grow out some facial hair, like I kind of like don't have any difficulties like passing as like a regular male. So and with like the surgery, or with like not having surgery, so like the testosterone came back online like surprisingly quickly after 8 years
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah.
of suppression. My like T levels were back to normal within 2 months
Wow.
Wow.
after 8 years of like being zero. So kind of crazy how the body works like that.
Yeah, that is. What's life like for you now?
Oh, it's great. Yeah. I mean, like socially, I'm very happy. Like work is so much easier. Like, and also like I can just like go out in public. Like one of the things, this seems so trivial, but like when I was identifying as trans and trying to live this life as a trans feminine person, like obviously like presenting as a feminine person and having facial hair, it causes social discrepancy. And even though I had like 11 rounds of laser, I still had to like shave every day if I wanted to reasonably attempt to blend in as like a feminine person and not present this like discrepancy that causes people to like stare at you or otherwise trigger my own self-consciousness. And so I would be like, yeah, like, yeah, but it's like a pain in the ass to like shave every single day. But it's like, oh, I want to go to the grocery store. I just need to run up to like Walgreens or something. Like I'd have to like go shave just to run up to the store. And I just like, it seems so trivial. And then also at work, like, oh, I can't show myself on my camera. I got to shave. I got to do all that stuff. So like just the mere fact that like I don't have to put effort into my appearance to be a socially acceptable person. I can just like be myself, throw on some clothes, go live my life and not be so self-conscious all the time. It's so wonderful to not have this like obsession about passing and blending in and worrying about how people are perceiving me. So like socially now it's just like so, and at the time, and this was one of the motivating factors for my detransition, but I just really I missed being normal. Like I missed blending into a crowd of people, like just being out in a crowd, like in public, and just being a regular person and who not someone who stands out or sticks out or is otherwise like weird or something. And it's, I don't know, I just really missed being like normal. Um, so it's nice. And like I still have the underlying disposition towards AGP. I just kind of keep it, and I still indulge in that to some extent, but I just keep it in the privacy of my bedroom.
If you had known, when did you learn about AGP, I guess? Like if you had gotten that information prior to transitioning, what you were experiencing, would that have influenced your decision at all, or did it influence your
No,
detransition? Or no?
I actually was very familiar with the concept. In my book I wrote when I was like early in my transition, I wrote like several essays critiquing the theory because I had read Julia Serrano's critique of the autogynephilic theory and her alternative model, which is called the female embodiment fantasy model, which is basically it's saying that that theory says like rather than AGP being the source of gender dysphoria, it flips it around the way so that the gender dysphoria coming from the mismatched gender identity at birth, according to the Born This Way model, it's the underlying repressed gender identity that creates the paraphilia in response to having it be socially repressed. And then when you sort of embrace your transition, you embrace your trans identity, you no longer have to repress it. And so it gets like, it sort of goes away because it's, this is the big critique of the theory from the trans angle. It's like, well, once you embrace your trans identity and you start doing it full time and you go on hormones, like all this stuff goes away. And that was also my experience. Like when I like nuked my testosterone with like HRT, like all these desires and the arousal component. And once I started like wearing women's clothing all the time, like it just became completely normalized, and there was like no like fetishistic arousal component to it whatsoever. It just became like a part of my regular life. Like, you know, it's like wearing this shirt now. It doesn't do anything for me. It's just a piece of clothing. So, but so that was at the model. So I'm actually aware of autogynephilia, and most trans women are aware of it, but it's a commonly accepted in the trans world that it's a debunked pseudoscientific theory that has its roots in transphobia. So it's just people are aware of it, but they just don't take it seriously.
Right, right. Okay, yeah. So I know like that narrative, but I guess I wasn't realizing, um, yeah, how pervasive the Julia Serrano model is, and so that's kind of how they all interpret it. Is yes, we know we have these feelings and that they're sexual, but that's only because of the underlying gender mismatch. And then once we nuke our testosterone, magically the sexual feelings
Right.
go away.
And if you go on like Ask Transgender and the subreddit or whatever, or any of these forums, and someone posts, you know, it's like every week someone will post, you know, like, is it a fetish? And they kind of give a classic AGP story. And then
Right.
like the number one upvoted comment is usually a link to like his essay. There's like a few of these essays that just are very common and they're commonly shared and everyone reads them. But it's like, is it just a fetish? And it's sort of like, gives the Julia Serrano sort of alternative model, which is that it's the kink is an outlet for repressed gender identity. That's the model.
And in that
And
model, there's no explanation at all for why the gender identity would be mismatched from the body, right? I mean, there's then no mechanism for that because the AGP is no longer the mechanism.
well, the mechanism is usually like the brain intersex theory. It's like, oh, we have intersexed brains that causes the mismatch, which, you know, usually they are relying on, you know, sort of like
Study of homosexuals.
yeah, like a tenuous grasp of like the neuroscience or some sort of like neurosexist like belief that there's like this. Yeah, I don't know, and also there's this idea that, well, you know, there's always been trans people in history, so this is just a natural part of human variation. So we don't need to explain it. We don't need a mechanism. We just take it for granted as like as like an existing part of human variation within the population. So like if you buy into that model, then there's no need to explain anything any more than you need to explain like why there's redheads. It's just it's just some people are born like that. It's the born this way narrative.
Which, you know, if we abandon the science of all naturally occurring phenomenon, there wouldn't be science. I'm too much of a
Right.
science nerd, right? I mean, it's not that I'm trying to prove that AGP is awful, but I'm just curious. I'm curious to know why things happen. I mean, the fact that the
Yeah.
sky is blue, we have an explanation for that. It doesn't mean that we're trying to change the color of the sky.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
is interesting though, because, you know, like the sort of both models, the like female embodiment theory and the AGP theory, they both sort of like roughly account for the same set of phenomena. And then the question is like, well, which is the more parsimonious explanation? Which fits into the evidence? And it's like the appeal to the gender identity, you know, explains it, but the question is it a good explanation? And is it as good of an explanation? But then you ask this question, well, what constitutes a good explanation? And if you're explaining the phenomenon using a construct that is itself not measurable, because I'm not aware of any way to measure gender identity. Like, so you're explaining the phenomenon using a theoretical construct that no one has ever come up with a way to measure it. So that's why I prefer, you know, AGP, just because we can at least measure it. And also, I think for independent theoretical reasons, I made like a tweet about this the other day where it's sort of like, to me, it seems like in child development, like desire comes first, identity comes later. So like if you're explaining like desire.
That's actually reversed in females, but go on.
Oh, really? I'd be
Yeah, yeah,
interested.
yeah. But go on, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was just say, well, at least for male sexuality, I would say like desire comes first because children don't have the cognitive, like a young infant does not have like full blown identities in their head. But they have desires because I think desires sort of precede the cognitive ability to construct like a complicated social identity. So that would be my sort of like reason for preferring the AGP causal story, which is that it makes sense that sexuality would come first just because sexuality is like such a core aspect of human evolution that would have deep roots in our evolutionary history, whereas like a more complicated social identity, I feel like would come after. But I'm very curious, like about your statement about the being at the flip side for the females.
Oh, well, I wanted to kind of wave the female side in on the whole female embodiment, the Julia Serrano theory, and because that does not apply to FTM. There's even I who believe that there is that AAP does exist, and I believe that was my mode to gender dysphoria. There was nothing fetishistic about it, like there was no like at all, and so even if you've got all the FTMs, whether they have like this typical social contagion thing or some sort of target location, if we want to subscribe to that theory, still there's not anything. There's not going to be any like clothing fetish. Well, I stole my brother's clothes when I was little. I would like sneak and try, but there was nothing remotely sexual about him. I just loved his clothes and hated my clothes, But so there was. So I guess for me, my experience of gender dysphoria very closely aligns with the AGP experience, but there was nothing ever sexual about it. So it kind of knocks the whole thing on its face, but it's still that same kind of like drawing and shame and yada yada. But what interesting thing, a study was done on lesbians in that many reported that their masculine identity preceded their attraction to women. So the sexual attraction to women arose as a manifestation of the masculine identification that came first. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. That, I mean,
Yeah.
I can't speak to that experience, obviously, but I mean, that sort of tracks. I've heard people like Michael Bailey say that female sexuality is more contextual, whereas like male sexuality is like not contextual. It's like it's more rigid, I guess is the word to use.
Yeah. I think a lot of female sexuality is really influenced by identity and social setting, and that's why you've got a lot of like the lesbians until graduation, because being a lesbian and graduate in college has some social leverage, and in that moment they probably are genuinely attracted to women because it's just part of their identity. But that men don't work that way, so it's
right.
quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
well, thank you
that's
so
the
much
sort
for
of
being
thing.
here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is great. Like, very happy to have these conversations, and I appreciate you guys inviting me on.
It's been great to chat with you, Ray. I hope we get a chance to talk to you again soon.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.